Today we have the Hidden Squares block. It's 12-inch finished, and here is the block, the diagram. I call it Hidden Squares because this is one of those things, how many squares are in this? You have the big square, you have the squares in the corner, squares in the middle, and then you have these squares here, and these are kind of the hidden squares, these four that are going into the corners. So anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting. Here is what they look like, block to block. This would be really neat, I think, to have different colors of the one fabric here and then have a variety of colors in the center. I really like this secondary design here. Now we're going to look at the patches. You have several different ways to cut these and to piece them. The first way is to rotary cut everything by hand. The second way is you're still cutting by hand, but you're going to use different methods to piece the flying geese and the half square triangles. And then the third way is with your AccuQuilt dies. So for patch A, it's a 3-inch finished half square triangle. For hand cutting, you'll cut 3 7/8 squares, cut them in half once diagonally, and you'll have 2 patches. So for the dark fabric, you'll need 4 patches, which means you'll need to cut 2 squares, cut each one in half diagonally. If you're using the 2 at a time method or the flying geese 4 at a time, you'll just need 2 squares of this fabric, and you just cut the squares, you do not subcut. And it's the same thing with the light blue fabric, only you'll need 12 patches, which would be 6 squares, and subcut those, or just 6 squares for the other method, the half square triangle, 2 at a time, and the flying geese. For the white fabric, we just need 4 patches. We're not going to do anything special with those because the white fabric is here in the square on point, and we'll need to sew triangles to either side of this square. Patch B is a 6-inch finished quarter square triangle, and this is for the geese part of the flying geese, and these are on the sides, and it's the B patch. So you'll need 4 patches if you're going to just cut all of your pieces. You'll cut 7 1/4 squares, cut them in half diagonally twice for your 4 patches. So you have patch 1, 2, 3, 4. If you're using the flying geese 4 at a time, we just need the square. You don't subcut it into the little triangles. For patch C, it's a 6-inch finished square on point. We cut the patch 4 3/4 inches, and we just need 1 patch. And here are the AccuQuilt dies. Now let's look at the fabrics, and I'll show you more of what I'm talking about. These are the patch A. These are for the half square triangles and for the sky part of the flying geese. So for the flying geese, we'll need to have 4 of these squares that go with the large geese portion of the block. This is patch B. And then for the half square triangles, we'll need 2 of each fabric, and these triangles are in the corners. Half square triangles are in the corners. And for the square on point, we have this patch A, which we cut into triangle patches, and we will stitch them on either side, on all the sides of the square on point. We're going to start with the half square triangles. So we'll take the light fabric, it will be these 2 blue parts, and we'll draw a diagonal line on the back side of both of those. And while we're at it, we're going to draw diagonal lines on the back of these. So all of your medium blue fabrics, or whichever fabric you choose for this, will have diagonal lines drawn on the back. And we'll put these 2 fabrics together. If you're not familiar with this, stay tuned for a short segment that shows you how to do this. On the back side of the light fabric, we're going to draw a diagonal line, put the fabrics together, right sides together, and we're going to stitch on either side of the diagonal line. Here is the diagonal line drawn, and then the stitching on both sides. Now we cut this in half along the diagonal line, Then we have our 2 half square triangles. Press the seams open and cut off the nubs. The half square triangles are done. Now we're going to move on to the flying geese 4 at a time. If you're not familiar with this technique, then stay tuned and there's a short demo of how to do it. For flying geese 4 at a time, you need 1 large square and 4 small squares. The large square is the geese part of the flying geese, and the small squares are the sky part of the flying geese. On the back of each of the small squares, draw a diagonal line. Place 2 of the small squares like this on the large square, right sides together. You line up these edges and make sure these lines line up. Then you're going to stitch 1/4 of an inch on both sides of that drawn line. Here are the 2 stitching lines on either side of the marked line, and now we cut it in half on the marked line. Now you'll open these up and press your seams open on both sides. Cut off the nubs. Now you'll place another square in this corner. Here's your diagonal line, and stitch on either side of the diagonal line. And do that for both of these. When you're stitching, your stitches should come out or start right at this point, this intersection here, this 90-degree angle. Cut this in half on the diagonal line, and you have these 2. Press your seams open and cut off your nubs. And do the same for this one. 4 flying geese. Flying geese are done, and the last unit we need to do is the square on point. If you are not familiar with sewing these, then stay tuned for a short demo. Otherwise, you can jump ahead to finish the block. Piecing the square on point unit using rotary cutting patches. You have your 4 half square triangles that go on the corners and your large square in the center that's set on point. I like to start by piecing opposite sides first, and what I do is flip this over, center the square on the triangle, matching these edges, the long edge of the triangle and one side of the square. You want to see if these triangles over here on the right and here on the left are roughly the same size. You just kind of eyeball it. So there, I'm going to go with that. Stitch 1/4 inch from this edge, a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way down. Do this side as well. Press your seams open, and if you look, these edges extend here, and what I'm going to do now is just trim these off straight in line with the side of the square. Put your half square triangle down with the right side facing up, and then place this in the center, and then check the size of your triangles overhanging here. And what you're going to do here, you will start stitching right here in this V section where this point meets. And this should be a 1/4 inch from here to the edge of this fabric. Start here, stitch a 1/4 inch all the way to this side, and you should come out here at the same part on this side. And do that on both sides. And here's what the stitching looks like. And now you're going to press your seams open. And here's the finished unit. Now just trim off these little nubs on the sides. And your unit's finished. Piecing the square on point using AccuQuilt. I like to start by piecing opposite sides first. And you're going to place the half square triangle piece on top. We need to center it. I just kind of eyeball it, and I'm looking at this little triangle of the bottom fabric poking out here. You can barely see it. It's a little triangle poking out here, and then on the other side there's a little triangle poking out here. What you want to do is try to get them as close to the same size as possible. So I'm just kind of shifting it a little bit. And you're going to take it to your machine, and your 1/4 inch should be right here at this point. So you stitch from this point 1/4 inch all the way down, and you come off at this point. And it's more important that you have the 1/4 inch than if you're exactly on the point. And you'll do that for both sides, this side and then this opposite side. Press your seams open. Now we'll flip it over and do the other 2 sides. You take your triangle, and now you have sides that you can match. You see the triangle has the points cut off. These points are going to line up with what we just sewed. So if you look here, you see they line up with this edge, these 2 edges, here, here, and across the top. Now you'll stitch 1/4 inch from that point here all the way down to this other point, and do that to both sides. It's really difficult to see the stitching because I used white thread, but you can see it coming out here, this little tag here and over here. If these don't match perfectly, if it's like it's not long enough, don't stretch this triangle because you'll just make the unit wonky. Just center it as much as you can and stitch 1/4 inch. Now we'll just press it open and it will be finished. And there's your finished unit. At some point when you finish your square on point unit, you'll have to sew something else to it. And you want to keep these points nice and sharp. And sometimes you might be matching it to a seam line or a plain piece of fabric or maybe another point. And I'm going to show you how to keep these points nice. If you've pressed your seam open, you will see where these 3 fabrics intersect and form a point right here. That's your point on the back, and it's also your point on the front. So you can stitch with this part on top, and you'll be able to make sure that your point stays there. I take a pin and put it right there at the point, and then pick it up on this back side. And in this case, I'm going to come down about 1/4 inch and then put that right in the seam line. That way the point will end up right on the seam line. Put your fabric pieces together and line up the top edges or the edges that you need to line up. And make sure your pin is perpendicular, goes straight down into the fabric, like that. If you're at an angle like this, your points won't match. So make sure they're straight, perpendicular to the fabric, and then put it into the fabric. When you start sewing, line up these edges here. Start at your 1/4 inch and sew all the way down, and you're going to aim for this point where that pin goes into the fabric. And you'll know that you're matching the point and the seam line on the back. And straighten your bottom edge again and continue stitching 1/4 inch off. And here's what the stitching looks like if you can barely see it on here with this thread. It goes right across here, leaving the point open. You're not stitching over the point. And then if I flip it over, you'll see it's not exactly 1/4 inch there, but that doesn't matter because what you want is the point to match the seam allowance here. Now just press the seam open and you're finished. All the units are finished, so let's put the block together. The half square triangles go on the corners, the flying geese on the sides. Sew the units into rows, 3 rows, then sew the rows together and your block is finished. You're going to be seeing a lot of red, white, and blue blocks because I promised to make a quilt of Valor. So I'm going to have 12 blocks, so I'll be sure and show you the quilt when it's finished.